today. My name is Eleonora Natale. I'm a lecturer at the Department of War Studies, King's College London, and an affiliated member of King's Brazil Institute. It's a real pleasure for me, also on behalf of the director of King's Brazil Institute, to welcome you to this event and celebrate really the partnership that we have created between King's College London and the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico and the Center for Mexican Studies at UNAM-UK. A symbol of which is exactly this series of international conferences, actually the second part of a series of international conferences that we are hosting here at King's Brazil Institute. So I'm really, really happy to be chairing this event today. We have Dr. Brenda Morales Muñoz with us, who will present her work on the Peruvian narrative about the internal armed conflict. So we are really looking forward to hearing from you, Brenda. I'm just going to say very quickly a couple of words on how the event works. So there will be first presentation from Dr. Morales Muñoz, followed by a Q&A session in which the audience has the opportunity to drop their question in the chat function or to raise their little virtual hand on the screen and intervene in the conversation. So really, I'm really glad to see that this partnership between UNAM and King's College is growing, and it's actually responding to a growing demand for more Latin America across the college, both in the curricula, but also in the research activities and research networks. So it's really great to see so much enthusiasm and so much participation on both sides of the Atlantic in this initiative. So I won't take any more time. I'm just going to leave the floor to Professor Ana Elena González, who's going to say a few words. She's the director of the Center de Estudios Mexicanos in between UNAM, Reino Unido. So the floor is yours, Ana Elena. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eleonora. It is indeed a great pleasure for me to greet all of you on this, the second part of something that we began last year. It is really very exciting to get to know the type of research done in Latin American studies at King's College throughout the different departments, and in particular with our fraternal relationship with the Brazil Institute, who has been very, very prolific and very generous. We wish to keep an open invitation for all scholars from King's, whether the Brazil Institute or the War Studies Department, for collaborations and student exchange, which is something that becomes easier, I hope, through these virtual exchanges. We have a very interesting program awaiting for us today with Dr. Brenda Morales. We're really looking forward to that and to make increase awareness about the importance of Latin America within the world stage, and also in particular within British universities, no? And how we can contribute to make that dialogue more significant in all senses. Welcome you again, and I look forward to listening to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ana Elena. And now I just wanted to leave the floor to Professor Berenice Ortega, who's going to introduce our great speaker today. Berenice?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody here in the UK, and good morning for those of you listening to us in Latin America. We are very, very pleased. On behalf of the Latin American Studies Department at UNAM, I am very pleased to be here to have collaborated in the organization of these two series of conferences. The one we had last year, where we had the pleasure of colleagues from King's, from the Brazil Institute at King's College, give us a series of conferences, brilliant conferences on different approaches on the Brazilian literature and politics. And this second series will mostly be to have our colleagues from the Latin American Studies Department in UNAM give a series of conferences about different approaches, historical and political approaches on Latin America as a whole. So this is all part of a greater effort between our two institutions to try and broaden our notions, our theoretical and methodological notions on the study of Latin America, not just Brazil, but also, as Ana Elena was saying, this increased interest on Latin America as a whole. So this is, I just wanted to say those words as part of a brief inauguration to this second series of conferences, but we will have 4 other events over the term, and you can check the program, which will be updated and more details will be available. But just as a taster, I'd like to tell you that we will have conferences on immigration, on populism in the region, and on social history. I believe our colleague is going to present on social history in Colombia, and another chat about philosophy in Latin America at the moment. So we've tried to cover various disciplines, as an interdisciplinary department that we are. So we hope that this will contribute to enrich our relationship, and that we can continue running series of conferences like these in future years. Thank you. And now I have the great honor of presenting my colleague, Dr. Brenda Morales. Dr. Morales holds a PhD, an MPhil, and an undergraduate degree in Latin American Studies from UNAM. She specializes in the study of contemporary Latin American narrative, particularly written by women, as well as Peruvian literature and the fictionalization of different types of violence and maternity. She is a founding member of the Seminar on Contemporary Latin American Narrative Studies, and is a member of the Seminar on Human and Imaginary Dimensions of Urban Space, both at UNAM. She has numerous publications and over 10 years teaching experience on Latin American literature. She is currently a full-time professor at the Latin American Studies Department in UNAM and belongs to SNI, the official national research system in Mexico. So today, trying to cover this broad interdisciplinary range that we have in our department, her lecture will give a general overview on how the Peruvian Internal Armed Conflict broadly from the 1980s to the beginning of the 21st century has been fictionally represented in narrative, especially in novels and short stories. And it will emphasize the differences between the origins of the authors and the way in which the actors, victims, soldiers, or members of the Shining Path have been characterized in literary works. So it is a great honor and pleasure. Dr. Morales, I give the floor to you.
Thank you, Berenice. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here opening this second cycle of conferences, Transatlantic Reflections, Rethinking Latin America Today, the Center for Latin American Studies, UNAM, at King's College London. Before I start my lecture, I want to thank all the people who made this possible. Ana Elena González Treviño, Director of the Center for Mexican Studies, UNAM-UK, Vinicius Di Carvalho, Director of King's Brazil Institute, Andrea González, Coordinator of the Latin American Studies Department, UNAM, and especially Berenice Ortega, Professor of the Latin American Studies Department, UNAM, for the support and work to make this happen. I will give my lecture in English, hoping everybody can understand me. And at the end, there will be time for questions and comments that I will try to answer in English. But I excuse in advance if I only can do it in Spanish. I will try my best. Now I'm going to share screen. Please, Eleonora, let me know if you can see it.
Yeah, sure.
You can see it, right?
Yeah, we can see it. Perfect.
Okay. For many years now, I have been studying Peruvian literature, especially narrative. On this occasion, I will give a general overview on how the internal armed conflict has been represented fictionally in novels and short stories. Sorry. I think. In the image, you can see general information about the conflict in 1980 to year 2000, that the actors involved were police, army, Navy, Sinchis, that is a special police, and Rondero, that are self-defense groups that clash with Shining Path or Sendero Luminoso. The Communist Party of Peru, Shining Path, emerged in 1968 and was led from its origin by philosophy professor Abimael Guzmán Reynoso, alias Presidente Gonzalo. The objective was to put an end to the historical and structural conditions of injustice, poverty, and hopelessness in which many communities in Peru lived. Between 1968 and 1980, they dedicated themselves to political and propaganda work and to recruiting members in the Ayacucho universities. This wasn't a typical guerrilla. They did not seek to ally themselves with peasants or workers, but students and professors. In this map, here is a map of the conflict zone. The red pin, if you can see it, indicates Ayacucho. It's the area where more battles and massacres took place during war. And it's near, between Lima and Ayacucho, the Andes. The last 2 decades of the 20th century in Peru were marked by the confrontation of the subversive group Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso, and various government forces. The conflict was very complex and left dreadful consequences in several realms. Once it ended, there was a clear need to understand what would happen in the near past. And with this purpose, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, CBR for its initial in Spanish, Comisión de la Verdad y Reconciliación, was created in 2000. The commission presented its final report in 2003 with overwhelming results. The death toll was estimated at 69,280, where only 22,507 were identified. This left 46,773 missing Peruvians that probably rest in 4,600 mass graves that haven't been investigated till now. About 600,000 were estimated as displaced persons, 40,000 orphan children, and thousands were victims of arbitrary arrest, torture, rape, and forced recruitment to either governmental security forces or senderistas, that is the name given to the followers of Sendero Luminoso or Shining Path. Besides the socio-political aftermath, the economical consequences were very extreme. The damages were estimated at $20 billion. After gathering all this data, the report concludes with the following, I quote, "The internal armed conflict living in Peru has been the most long-lasting one, with the most extensive impact on national territory, and the most costly in economical and human lives of our history as a republic. The number of deaths exceeds by far the number seen during the Independence War and the war against Chile. The largest conflicts our nation has been involved." The final report made Shining Path responsible for the majority of the deaths, with 64% as its toll. The armed forces were conferred 30%, and 60% of the remaining deaths were attributed to other stakeholders like Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement, Movimiento Revolucionario Tupac Amaru, that was a smaller guerrilla, peasants patrols or rondas campesinas, and other unidentified agents. Though the document determines that this was not an ethnical conflict, one cannot ignore the fact that racial discrimination was present in many ways. It is a fact that indigenous groups, historically ignored, were the most affected during the war. The rebels and the military never show interest in understanding their needs. As Carlos Guamán states, both groups considered them an obstacle to reaching their goals. This is why they were caught in the crossfire. One group searched to transform the existing system, while the other one wanted to maintain it. Both factions kidnap, torture, and murder peasants, authorities, and citizens, men and women of different age and sociocultural ranges. Those who said they defended the people in name of the government or in name of Shining Path only corrupted them. The result of the above is that 75% of the fatal victims spoke Quechua as their mother tongue. 79 live in rural areas and 66% were dedicated to agricultural activities. All of these figures bring to account the seriousness and the reach of the conflict that fractured the Peruvian society to the extent where the recovery process has been so complicated that even Victor Beach points out that as a national community, Peru hasn't created a minimum consensus on how to remember the political violence of the near past. Beach mentions that to comprehend the complexity of the war, it must be understood that it didn't emerge spontaneously and that Shining Path was not its only cause. It is fundamental to remember the historical circumstances that promoted it, as violence is never an alienated fact. It emerged and disseminated in specific conditions, with antagonists that are created with time and social conflict that is ignored or systematically denied or unattended by the current powers. In Peru's case, the conflict was born with an absent government in most parts of its territory, by excluding the indigenous people, showing lack of interest in education, and a corrupt political class. And it made more visible the conflict between rich and poor, the urban capital and rural provinces, and between Criollos, that is, people recognized as white or mostly white, and the Andinos, indigenous people or with indigenous traits. This intense and prolonged episode of violence in Peru's history has strongly influenced the collective imagination and the arts. It comes as no surprise that Peruvian literature has used it as one of its core subject matters in the 1980s. According to Antonio Cornejo Polar, Peruvian literature has always been obsessed with revealing and criticizing its reality. He suggests the term heterogeneity to explain the complexity of Peruvian literature. To him, it cannot be other than a complete contradiction where two or more sociocultural universes meet conflictingly. According to Cornejo, Peru is a country built on cracks and crevices, and this gives as a result heterogeneous literature that beneath its Western texture lays the native voices and native awareness, and is recognized for being dispersed, brittle, unstable, and heteroclite with its own limits. In Peruvian literature produced in recent years, the subject of violence is of vital importance. It is evident that many authors have been interested in elucidating the traces of the confrontation in their works, keeping the debate alive about the past and that defy the official position of neglect and oblivion. Culture and art are mourning what politics hasn't managed to mourn. It is the symbolic representations that refer to the political violence, the ones that are trying to open space to build new imaginaries. They show the traumatic processes and give access to a type of knowledge others cannot reach. They help confront the past from a critical point of view, to know about it better, politicize it even more, and inform about its responsibilities and suggest collective learning. There is a vast production of this subject matter, but not much scholar research has been dedicated to these works. Most of it is focused only on the sociocultural aspect. It studies literature based by Limeño authors originally from Lima, printed by great publishing houses, and are aimed at foreign readers almost exclusively. This conversation covers the different representations made of the internal armed conflict in fiction, novel and short stories, Andinos and Limeños. Violence is one of the main subjects in literature, particularly in narrative, that turn into the main forum to discuss the armed conflict that lashed the country since 1980. During this horrific situation, the writers couldn't keep a distance and search for ways to talk about it, reflect on it, and portray the extreme situations that were happening. Broadly speaking, one could say that there were two sides. One, in the very beginning, where the writers shared some affinity with the armed conflict as a transformational option for Peruvian society, and another one that arrived with the development of the confrontations, where writers took a clear distance once they learned about the atrocities made by both parties involved and focused on revealing the devastation taking place in the crossfire of senderistas and government forces. Since the beginning of the war, some authors confronted and analyzed it with fiction. Why write about this? Novelist Jorge Eduardo Benavides, in his article titled Political Violence and Narrative in Peru, shows the motive he had to write from his own experience. I quote, "It was impossible to pull myself away from the events, that reality that touched me so deeply and an entire generation of Peruvians. How does one withdraw from that horizon? The writers capture the fears and cautions, the helplessness and the violence that lurked those days because there wasn't any time left or willingness to look beyond. The author claims he couldn't ignore the influence of these times, mainly when what happened directly affected his everyday life and stability. Just as Benavides, many other writers were interested in the subject, as proven by several works that talk about this. Novels, short stories, poems, plays, and movies have approached it from many perspectives. Maybe because it affected to a greater or lesser extent artists and intellectuals, and because the wounds have taken a long time to heal. On this respect, Santiago López Maguiña affirms, the internal armed conflict lived in Peru during the 1980s mainly is an event that still has persistent aftermath of consequences. Furthermore, it is still a latent presence. It is marking the bodies and the individuals, and it still affects them. Of course, the war wounds are carried by the affected, by the victims and the aggressors, but they are engraved in a collective imagination. The wound of the war has not been stitched. Part of these are the tales, stories, novels, and poems that take care of the war and its consequences. The literary production regarding the internal armed conflict in Peru is constant, abundant, and heterogeneous on its arguments, characteristics, and impact. There is a multiplicity of views and points of view, which shows the ideological diversity of the writers, influenced by diverse factors as their closeness to the facts, their social class of origin, ethnicity, among others. There is also an early production. The American scholar Mark Cox has traced publication on the subject. In 1988, he published an annotated bibliography of narrative fiction about Sendero Luminoso and the guerrilla war in Peru, where he counted 32 authors that wrote 62 short stories and 11 novels. In 2000, he published an anthology entitled El Cuento Peruano en los Años de Violencia, where the number of writers rose to 60, over 100 short stories and 30 novels. 4 years later, he edited Pachaticray, where the corpus included 104 writers, 192 short stories, and 46 novels. In 2008, he published a new bibliography in the Latin American Literary Review magazine, where he found 165 authors, 306 short stories, and 68 novels. However, he noted that if an American can find as many works, this is an indicator that there are many more that only a few people are aware of, and that these numbers must be larger, as it is well known that great part of the literature produced in the Peruvian provinces are unknown outside the country or even in Lima itself. In 2010, he published a new book, Sasha Tiempo, where he counted 30 novels in English, about 20 films in Spanish and in English. This book is divided into 3 parts. The first part is a series of essays made by Andino writers, the second part by scholars, and the third part surprises it as has writings by former troopers that are or were imprisoned. The publishing of these types of work is very rare, so this is a good opportunity to learn about this other perspective. Most writers and critics concur that the first authors to talk about the war were the Andino, as they were closer to the events. For writer Luz Nieto de Gregory, the explanation for this lies in the fact that these writers felt they were culturally closer to the stakeholders and victims of the conflict, and therefore were more sensitized due to the tragedy that grew in proportion year after year. These writers only follow the track of their literary predecessors. They portray the drama lived by this mountain village of indigenous people and mestizos, caught in the crossfire unleashed by rebel groups and the response of the oppressive government forces. These were authors that didn't write from or about Lima, that they were immersed in a terrible environment. They were every moment the Senderista presence pulse, and the war affected everyday life. Though there is a consensus that in the first years, there were literary texts that talk about the war, at that moment, this did not exist. On one side, it was of no appeal to the critics, and on the other side, there was a distribution problem. There were many publications on the provinces, but most of them never arrived at the capital, so it was thought that nobody was writing about this. This is how, for many years, this substantial literary production was ignored, even for a critic as relevant as Antonio Cornejo Polar, that in 1994 declared that Peruvian narrative had gone mute in presence of the limitless violence that bled the country. On the other hand, Martín Lienhardt, concurred with Cornejo regarding the absence of written texts, but he acknowledged that oral literature was the main one busy communicating the message. Since the beginning of the 1980s, the Ayacucho department has become the scenario of generalized repression that, under the excuse of any anti-terrorist battle, surged into what looks like an extermination campaign against the impoverished and therefore suspicious farmers. Until now, these events, almost absent in written literature, have caused repercussion on the oral production of surviving victims. For obvious reasons, this oral production is mostly unknown. The previous quote shows how Leonhardt gave a fundamental place to oral literature originated and circulating in the Andino region, and therefore didn't reduce the impact of the war exclusively to fictional written texts. It is worth mentioning that during the first years, this situation was practically unknown in Lima. On one hand, because of the lack of information, and on the other hand, due to the lack of interest. It was thought of as a local dispute and consequently distant. It was said, as Luis Nieto de Gregory mentioned, that it was only a matter between Cholos and Indios. Cholos are the indigenous people that have adapted to modern world changes. For instance, when they immigrate to urban centers, or mestizo people that had considerable indigenous heritage. Over time, other critics managed to see the silence Cornejo Polar mentioned was non-existent. Like Rita Nuxman, who considered that the answer of the writer was prompt. Worried about their country's situation, the authors tried to discover the events that caused the conflict and the ways all the different stakeholders were acting within it. For Nutzman, it was only natural that the writers were interested in the events that took place and for them to include this in their works. Classification of literary production. Literary production regarding the internal Peruvian conflict has been mostly organized in three ways. One, by origin, works made in Lima or in the provinces. Two, by main character representations against the military or against the senderistas. And three, by publishing date, during or after the war. By origin. The first strategy has been the most controversial, as there are critics and authors that discriminate against certain writers due to their origin, because they write from Lima, outside of the battle zone. Some of them defend the idea that only the Andino writers that were direct witness to this can talk about the conflict, and that the fact that others do this only has to do with a trend or with editorial marketing. It is clear that it's a very delicate subject, and therefore sensitivities are going to be struck. It is understandable why various authors that have represented this have been a target of this criticism, sometimes oversimplified and with polarized opinions, in other moments fair and objective. Some have been accused of defending the senderistas, others of defending the military, and many others of not knowing enough on the subject and even presenting frivolous works. In this sense, one of the strongest critics, writer Dante Castro, underlines the importance of the writer and the care he puts on the portrayal of the subject. This historical moment has cost Peru 69,000 dead. Because of this and all the pain left in thousands of Peruvian families, the point of view of the author is extremely important. Castro assures that fear restricted the works of some writers due to the danger of being accused of terrorist advocacy and induced self-censorship, condemned for the lack of knowledge and Andino state of mind. Nieto concurs with Castro with the idea of compromised literature and the need of the authors to state a clear posture when writing about the war. He points out that when mentioning it, being neutral is unethical. Meanwhile, José Antonio Jiménez Micó displays the known division between Limeña or Criolla narrative, whom he calls pituca demeaningly. By pituca, he refers to, in a controversial way, to literature produced to and for the urban public, mostly white public. And Andino, where he considers that the representatives of the latter have treated the subject more objectively and realistically, because the Limeños evidently show their disapproval towards Shining Path and in general to the problems within the region. These three writers also recognize that there is a great movement of Andino narrators that publish with great effort in marginal channels thanks to the small publishing houses in the provinces and literary contests of the area. With their works, they recreate this event without any predetermined preference to denigrate or elevate either faction, as done by, from this writer's point of view, by Barrio Vargas Llosa and other Criollo tradition representatives, as I will explain. The Criollo and Andino literature debate dates from a long time ago, but warns with the senderista conflict. This divided the Peruvian people and the writers that portray it in their works. Criolla narrative, as defined by Luis Nieto de Gregory, is the one that, due to its production, its texts, its reference, and its distribution and consumption system, are registered with the Criolla society and culture. Like this, Criolla is the hegemonic narrative of contemporary Peru, to the extent that when spoken of Peruvian narrative, regards mostly in the Criollo writer's narrative, on Criollo Peru or the broader Western world, and to be widespread mainly in Lima and the main coastal cities. In the other hand, Jorge Flores Aybar described the most genuine Andino literature by 5 characteristics: continuity of the mythical discourse, focus on the narrative facts of the rural environment. It is not telluric, if by this we understand the mere description of the rural environment. It uses new narrative forms and uses a subversive tone of the linguistic sign due to the prevailing political violence. Flores, just as the previously cited Dante Castro, points out that most of the representatives of Andean literature feel excluded and ignored by critics and publishing houses. In other words, marginalized from the canon. Besides, they are also misunderstood because they are sometimes accused of being very local or regional. Many of these writers consider that their works are underestimated by the hegemonic cultural sectors. In this sense, Carlos Guamán considers that there is such contempt and that the elements that entails to consider valuable or disqualify an artistic manifestation is not only in aesthetic taste, but also related to history, power, ideology, and cultural reputation. Carlos Guamán studies written literature in Quechua that many times has been undermined. To write, compose, or speak in Quechua still has racial, cultural, and political connotations. Runasimi or Quechua is weakened and it is linked to the all obsolete, degraded, primitive, useless, and all the derogatory objectives related to indigenous background, combined with commercial aspiration of certain artists and the preference of a Spanish-speaking audience and market. All of these reasons serve as a reminder that literature is not only based on its aesthetic functions, but includes the ethnical, political, and social functions as well, and that commercial and market phenomena come into play with the publishing and work outreach. Regarding the internal armed conflict, the debate within Peruvian literary circles has been very snarky and has increased the division among others, besides revealing the complexity of the strife and the relevance of taking a position by each other, concealed or not. All of the previously mentioned illustrate what Antonio Cornejo Polar pointed as the heteroclite plurality that defines Peruvian society and culture, where several sociocultural universes coexist. It is due to these particularities that Cornejo introduced the concept of heterogeneity to refer to this multicultural and fragmented literature. The differences between Criolla and Andino narratives are sociocultural, and this is why both offer different points of view that can occasionally complement each other without meaning that they ignore the questioning of or the literary critiques. It is fundamental to remember that Peru is a diverse and multicultural country, because if ignore the difference that divided the various literary tendencies, the hegemonic and the still minor become trivial. The armed conflict was of interest to representatives of different generations that approach it from different perspectives and hues. Some reflect a direct and immediate response to what was happening. Others offer afterthoughts from a distance. This way, the collection of texts offer a broad spectrum of views on the phenomenon that is inclusive and discussed among themselves. The great multiplicity of perspective enhances the knowledge on the subject. With this, one can tell that literature is a space where reflection and interpretation of social problems and historical events take place. Therefore, instead of opposing them, building bridges among them could be much more rewarding. By main character representations versus the military or versus the senderistas. The second point refers to the fictionally representation of the two main characters in the war. At first, the position tended to be very extreme, rejection or approval. The more cautious or non-polarized appear with the pass of time. Most of the first texts, though not exclusively, refer to the abuses of the senderistas, portrayed as fanatical, violent, and resentful people who decide to murder the innocent. With the development of the war, the way these characters are represented changes. Military men end up undermined, and the works published once the battle ended tend to portray the senderistas and the military less radically. The tone is much more conciliatory. They try to represent the actors away from the stereotypes and generalizations, making clear the notion that in both parties there were good and bad people. These tales intended to leave prejudice and commonplaces behind that many of the works are plagued with, underlining the fact that during the confrontation, every party involved inflicted despicable acts, senderistas, military, paramilitary, and self-defense groups called ronderos. By publishing date, during or after the war. The third point divides the literary production into two broad stages. The first one is during the armed battle. Generally speaking, in this first phase, most of the authors are from the provinces, resorted to writing short stories mainly, and had little access to publishing houses, which means limited distribution of their works. This first text talks direct about the conflict and tries to make sense of the violent and undecipherable reality. The second stage is when the battle was over, after a CBR's final report by Limeño authors that publish in prestigious publishing houses their novels that illustrate the consequences over the war itself. The main concern is a remembrance, since after 20 years of terror, a sense of relative peace and stability was back and allowed literature and other art forms to reflect on the immediate past. This way, it can be noted that despite literary works using the subject constantly, the beginning of the 21st century brought a surge of narrators interested in the aftermath and other traces left behind in the collective memory. Many are the so-called cosmopolite authors that perceive the battle from a different point of view as they are very distant in time and space. This is why there is less politicization and ideological affiliation by this group of authors, and if this before-mentioned distance granted them neutrality. But it must be said that these cosmopolite authors follow the canon and are linked to the hegemonic culture of the country, as they belong to a privileged group that has a certain political and ideological stance. In other words, westernized and with an approach to reconciliation. Now I will present a brief review of some fictional representation of the internal armed conflict of Peru in short stories and novel that, despite being brief, gives a general idea of the complexity and the development of the representation of the subject in fiction. The referred works are of different perspectives and ideologies and contribute to building a broad panorama. They establish dialogues among them, even with other armed forms, and their common ground demonstrate that shared concerns. They also certify, as claimed by Rita Nuxman in her book, Novel and Short Story of the 20th Century in Peru, that for the first time, in light of the common experience of violence, authors from all regions and all classes dash to the same subject. Before starting, I would just like to know that I will give out the titles of many publications that have only been published in Spanish, so the translation of most of these has been done by me. The manifestation of the conflict came earlier in the Peruvian short story than in the novel. In this genre, it was represented in a faster and straightforward way, maybe because some of its characteristics facilitated it, like the depth and brevity. I would like to start with the writer Hildebrando Pérez Guaranca, who in 1975 published the short story collection The Illegitimate, Los Ilegítimos, which has been considered the foundational text within Peruvian violence literature. It was published before the armed struggle, and it portrays the people's situation before the war, where most of them were poor and suffered abuse by the ruling class. This author, Hildebrando Pérez Guaranca, is controversial as he was a militant of Shining Path. He was arrested due to allegations against him in 1982. However, he was imprisoned briefly as escaped the Detention and Social Rehabilitation Center on March 2 of the same year, when a Senderista commando overthrew the penitentiary to free their political prisoners. A total of 70 guerrilla fighters and 300 common prisoners escaped during this raid. After this event, not much is known of his life. It seems that he lived an underground life. He even had ties with the Lucanamarca massacre on April 3, 1983, where about 70 people died. The first writer that engaged on this matter that there is a record of is Fernando Ampuero from Lima. His short story titled The Apartment, El Departamento, of 1982 narrates the death of an innocent car salesman, Mariano Robles, whose only crime was to lease an apartment previously taken by a rebel student. Robles is arrested by the police and released 4 times after long interrogations, but he didn't survive his last detention. The story shows the suspicious and repressive atmosphere introduced since the beginning of the war, as well as police abuse. Some other works published in Lima are Days of Fire, Días de Fuego by Fernando Cueto, and Hyenas in the Fog, Hienas en la Niebla by Juan Morillo Ganosa, only to mention a few. In the first, the impact of the armed struggle in the city is portrayed. The main character, Segundo Renteria, is a cop from the National Anti-Terrorist Administration, and it is his experience and thoughts that guide the plot. He's in the present handicapped due to a Senderista attack, remembering his days in the police academy, his many jobs, and his love life. The novel reveals that guerrilla fighters and their opponents belong to the same social background. The second has Diego de la Cruz as the main character, a middle-class immigrant from the province that builds a fortune as a Lima businessman. Despite considering himself as a left-winger, he lacks the conviction to join any political organization and constantly debates between enlisting himself to the revolutionary cause or his desire to live in a classless society. Violence appears when de la Cruz is arrested and imprisoned arbitrarily in solitary confinement, and his triggers memories of the political history of Peru. Among the Andino writers, 4 authors stand out for writing several times in their works. Enrique Rosas Paravicino has 7 short stories. One of them is titled Through the Door of the Wind, Por la Puerta del Viento, where a 59-year-old retired professor, Nibardo Portugal, starts a journey to the Totorani town to take his 17-year-old funerary cast. During the journey, the story tells how he enlisted with Shining Path and describes the terror in the atmosphere of the region. The second is a narrator from Cusco, Luis Nieto de Gregory, that has also a vast short story production of the subject matter. Among his tales, Eves, Vísperas, and The Young Woman That Went to Heaven, La Joven que Subió al Cielo, stands out. The first one stands out as Vísperas, stands out as it fictionalized Hildebrando Pérez Guaranca above mentioned. The story is focused on Amadeo, a character that quits his dream of becoming a writer and moves to Ayacucho to take a job as an English teacher. Amadeo puts down the provincial writers. There is only one that deserves certain respect, Grimaldo Rojas Huarcaya, arguably Pérez Guaranca, that writes a short story collection titled The Deprived, Los Desposeídos, a clear reference to the illegitimate, Los Ilegítimos. Grimaldo is accused of terrorism and imprisoned in the Huamanga jail, but a Senderista commander raids the jail to free the political prisoners and he flees with them. Amadeo decides to write a short story about this event. He doesn't understand Grimaldo's decision to join the armed battle because for him, it is not heroic, but a fool's, to give your life to a false and dogmatic doctrine. The short story can be considered metafictional because it speaks of Amadeo's problem during the writing process and the complexity of fictionalizing a guerrilla fighter and the obstacles to making it as a writer. In The Young Woman That Went to Heaven, Daniela and Pedro, the main characters, meet and fall in love in the Huamanga jail, where she is a nurse and he is a political prisoner. Despite trying to make a living in a Senderista camp, their relationship fails in light of the constraints and demands of undercover living that imply sacrificing their personal life. Both tales by De Gregory focus on the way the characters get involved with Shining Path and make ethnical decisions in the face of political violence. The third Andean author is Oscar Colchado, that in his short stories like Black Rage, Cordillera Negra, Towards Hanak Pacha, Hacia el Hanak Pacha, and The House of Pine Hill, La Casa del Cerro del Pino, have the conflict present. His novela, Rosa Cuchillo, deserves a special mention, winner of the National Prize Federico Villarreal and one of the most interesting texts on the subject matter. Here, 3 stories are interwoven and narrated from 2 levels, a real one and a mythical one. The first one is told from the kingdom of the dead hand in hand with Rosa Cuchillo, that is from an indigenous town that has been miserably and currently is at war due to Shining Path. Rosa died of grief because she learned that her eldest son, Liborio, recruited for the guerrilla, had been murdered. Rosa's soul travels in search of her lost relatives, her parents, her husband Domingo, her son Simon, and mainly Liborio, whom she wishes to find in heaven, the Hanak Pacha. A very interesting aspect of this is the inclusion of traditions and beliefs of the Andino communities. The other story, narrated in second person, is dedicated to explaining how Liborio turns into a guerrilla fighter. his recruitment, preparation, and senderista activities. During his undercover life, he noticed that the leaders are not well acquainted with the indigenous ideology, and to make matters worse, they don't care to learn about it. This makes Liborio a suggestive character, and he's not an orthodox fighter. He's a man that questions the party. The third story is the one of Mariano Ochante, a poor farmer that, disappointed by the authoritarian and brutal ways of the rebels, is forced by the military to serve as an informant and joins the peasant patrol, Ronda Campesina, in the counterinsurgency campaign. Hurt by the senderistas and delusional with fever, he spends his deathbed hours in a monologue chronicle that illustrates the horrors of his town caused by both factions. It is here where the reader learns about the harsh situation lived by the people of the conflict zone that were abused on several fronts. Rosa Cuchillo is a novel where the reader can note the complexity and intensity of the conflict and the indigenous communities. Just like in Colchado's work, the peasant patrols or rondas campesinas also appear in Of Love and War by Victor Andrés Ponce and in The Apple of Our Eyes by Miguel Arribas Plata. In Ponce's novel, the main character is Nicome de Sierra, a school teacher in Rinconada, a town outside Apurimac, that is tired of the abuses of the rebels, putting together a peasant patrol with his students. Sierra has a hard personal life. His girlfriend, Violeta, was murdered, and the impunity of the murder is a field that makes him lead the self-defense group, as he no longer has anything to lose. Arribas Plata work focuses on the popular war combats. The title refers to the famous phrase by Lenin, that one must look after the party as the apple of our eyes, with utter loyalty. This axis of anecdotes is made by the adventure of several characters, guerrilla, military, police, and peasant patrollers. At last, Dante Castro, that is from the Callao province, established his work and interest in the Andino area. He has written 9 short stories where Ñacay Pacha, The Time of Pain, and The War of Archangel Gabriel are the ones that stand out. Here, the Yuyaracancha mountain range is forced to reply to the demands made by Shining Path and the Peruvian army. The short stories show the impossibility of the Andino communities to stand aside from the war. First, they had to empathize with the senderistas and then please the military, going from one party to the other to protect themselves. It shows the population trapped in a dead end, as each solution implied more violence than the previous. Various works have been published that narrate life in Andino communities, pre- and post-war. For 3 generations, for example, the family of Manuel Jesus Medina altar piece, Retablo, by Julián Pérez, show the events of the Pumaranra, an Ayacuchan town involving problems between the landowners and miners, the Amorin, and the neighboring townspeople of Lucanamarca. The narrator seems to find reason for this inconvenience, so his brother will want to enlist himself by the senderistas. You can find on Netflix an adaptation of Retablo, a recent movie. In Candela Queme Luceros, by Felix Guamán Cabrera, the imaginary community of Yaguarguaita is devastated by the army. It was a very calm place before the war, where its people were hard workers and proud of their traditions. However, the order was lost due to hardships in communication, language boundaries, and cultural misunderstandings between the indigenous people and white authorities. One of the most popular novels that also take place in Andino territory is Lituma in the Andes, Lituma in Los Andes, by Barrio Vargas Llosa. The novel takes place in a minor community in the mountains where Private Lituma has to investigate the case of 3 laborers in Nacos that went missing mysteriously. He is one of the 2 civil guards looking after the construction of a road. Lituma thinks that these are most likely crimes by Shining Path, but it is only at the end that he learns that they were offered in sacrifice to the gods of the mountain by their indigenous peers to get their consent to build the road, which causes prejudice towards their religious and mythical beliefs. In Lituma in the Andes, the violence almost exclusively comes from the senderistas. For example, there is an episode where they take the town of Andamarca, and amid the tense and intimidating environment, the authorities, gaugers, and merchants are judged and end up stoned. Mario Vargas Llosa's novel has been strongly critiqued for not presenting the Andino world in depth, and remarks have been made on his lack of knowledge on the conflict by presenting the senderistas in a biased point of view as cruel, as an authoritarian, almost crazy for believing in a messianic leader that abuses their power brutality with no justification. One of his main critics, Dante Castro, points out that the Nobel Prize winner is one of the first narrators to portray the guerrilla acts with incoherent dashes, where the Criollo perspective, an incomprehended Andino world, and an international political standpoint of putting the rebels down. A point of view that barely appears is one of the children. Therefore, Pilar Dugui's short story, The Hunter, El Cazador, is very original. The story focuses on Darwin, a boy that has lived since he was 5 years old in a senderista camp, when his parents decided to join the underground life despite his opinion. Darwin doesn't wish to be in that situation and decides to escape, knowing that this could cost him his life and make his flight filled with anguish. He walks by the riverside, defying constant animal danger, but mostly that of the annihilation command that was sent to kill him and made up by his peers of his age. In different latitudes, Peruvian American writer Daniela Larcon includes the conflict in several of his works. He is the author of the short story I share with you, War by Candlelight, which gives its name to the collection published in 2005. Alarcon's case is atypical because he was born in Peru, but when he was like 3 years old, his family left the country because of the war and was settled in Alabama. So he grew up in the United States. He speaks Spanish fluently, but he writes in English. All his literary work has been first written in English and then translated into Spanish. And almost in all of his work, in some way or another, he addresses the issue of the internal armed conflict. Here are some of his works: Low City Radio, At Night We Walk in Circles, and The King is Always Above the People. Alarcon is professor, journalist, and co-founder of Radio Ambulante, a podcast of narrative and investigative journalism that publishes Latin American chronicles in Spanish. It's very interesting. I recommend it to you. You can listen to it on platforms such as Spotify or on the website radioambulante.org. If you were able to read the story War by Candlelight, you notice that War by Candlelight approaches the war from the point of view of two militants that are also two childhood friends, Fernando and Jose Carlos, and its temporal arc is extensive. It starts at 1965 and finishes in 1989. Most of the actions take place in the jungle, in combat, but we see the evolution of Fernando, how a university boy from the province became interested not only in certain political ideas, but also in joining the guerrilla, in going underground from Lima, how his life changed, his doubts, and also his regrets. In his novel, Lost City Radio, this depicts the impact on the confrontations 10 years after it ended. Norma is a host from a very successful radio show where names of missing and displaced people are shared to try to find them and rejoin them with their families. She's one of the victims, and her husband Ray has long been missing. One day, Victor appears. In her show, it's a boy that comes from a town in the jungle with a list of names that give her clues to Ray's whereabouts. Two other authors that write of the war after it finishes are Santiago Roncagliolo and Iván Taiz. In Red April, Abril Rojo by Roncagliolo, Felix Chacaltana Saldívar, district prosecutor in Ayacucho, must solve a series of crimes during Easter. His investigation is presented as a thriller where several past deaths, pain, and disappearance that he thought were gone appear. Meanwhile, in Taiz, A Place Called Oreja de Perro, the plot is based on a journalist's travel to an Andean town called Oreja de Perro to cover President Toledo's visit. The main character is confronted with the sequels of violent past that are present in the town and its people. On the other hand, Rock in the Andes by Fernando Iwasaki and The Berlin Wall by Rodolfo Nostroza are, I think, the only two works that have presented with humor this subject matter, though in Julio Ortega's Goodbye Ayacucho, some humoristic traits can be found as well. Ortega's novel, Adiós Ayacucho, is one of the first and most celebrated that have talked about Peru's armed conflict. It was published while it was ongoing and was adapted and played by the theater group Yuyachani for 2 decades. The protagonist is Alfonso Canepa, leader of the farmers of quinoa that is murdered by the police after being accused of terrorism. Once dead, he goes to Lima to demand the president the return of his bones to give himself a proper burial. The absurd petition of a mutilated body reveals the nonsense of the violence. Other authors that have included the conflict are Alonso Cueto in a short story and 3 novels. Pale Sky, Pálido Cielo takes place during Fujimori's period. Here, Luis, the main character, is shocked to learn that his parents and his brother Bruno had been militants of Shining Path and had died in a very early stage of the confrontations. With this revelation, his lifestyle and way of being changed dramatically. With this short story, we can see one of Cueto's recurring subjects looming. The son doesn't know of his parents' activities and gets involved with the war after it is over. Cueto also has a novel trilogy on the war that he has named the Redemption Trilogy. It starts with a Blue Hour, where an upper-class lawyer called Adriano Ormache discovers that his father belonged to the military that murdered and tortured during the war and that abused sexually of the indigenous women of the areas where his headquarters were at. The novel's main conflict revolves around the search of Miriam, one of these women that had been his father's prisoner that managed to escape. In The Passenger, he also tells the story of an ex-military that fought in Ayacucho that now turned into a taxi driver, pick up a woman he met in his soldier years. Trying to reivindicate himself, he tries to help her money-wise. And in The Traveler of the Wind, another ex-military in Lima meets a woman he thought that he had murdered in the Andes during the war. At last, I would like to mention and point out the scarce works written, or should I say published, by women. The Blood of the Dawn, La Sangre de la Aurora, it's a novel by Claudia Salazar Jimenez, published in 2013, focused on the violence against women during the armed conflict. It talks about the impact war had on three female characters from different social classes: a farmer, a photojournalist, and a Shining Path militant. All three experiences show the gender violence and abuse that was customary during the war and how female bodies were equally brutalized. As we have seen, we can perceive the interest of the writers of all origins and generations to reflect on the conflict in their works, fictionalize all the actors involved, and try to understand the extent of the war. I would also like to mention 4 anthologies that are focused on the short stories published of the 1980s: On the Road, the Peruvian short story, Cuentos Peruanos, Generación del 80, and Peruvian narrators of the 1980s. There are also 2 anthologies with a broader time frame that include many of the above cited and more recent works. The first one is before mentioned by Mark Cox, titled Peruvian Short Story in the Years of Violence, and All the Blood, Peruvian Short Story Anthology on Political Violence by Gustavo Faperón. These anthologies have been fundamental in the distribution of many of these tales that wouldn't be known by a broader public without these efforts, as they had originally been printed in very small publishing houses. To conclude, I would like to point out that remembering a violent and traumatic past is painful, but need to understand it and make sense of it. Todorov affirmed that making it understandable is also a way to know ourselves better. In this train of thought, literature can be of great use. On this, Bridget Newman remarks, literature as a part of the prevailing process of creating memory is endowed with a memory culture effectiveness and contribute to a new perspectivation of extra-textual orders of knowledge of values. The concept of memory staged within the medium of fiction may influence the extra-literary memory culture given that they are also actualized by recipients. Thus, these concepts can influence the creation and reflection of individual as well as collective images of the past. As a medium of cultural self-reflection, literary, through its aesthetic structure, paves the way for cultural change. According to Newman, literature can redefine the past and rebuild a collective memory. There is a space for memories in the fictional text that can acknowledge the damage and the guilt to see aspects of reality that are not available at first sight or that can find space in other types of discourses. These are ways of making grief public, to make it visible and maybe heal the wounds. The Peruvian Internal Armed Conflict left behind a great number of traces and stories of victims and aggressors that need to be told. Many of them have been used by literature and other art forms to counterbalance the imposed silence, denial, and oblivion. All of these works deserve the attention of readers and critics without a doubt. The works that I mentioned are not the only ones. There are many other novels and short stories that have addressed the subject, but I think my time is over. Now it's time for your questions and comments. I will be happy to hear them. Thank you all for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Brenda, for this amazing, amazing presentation. It was such a great overview of this very rich body of literature. I mean, you really inspired me to like read them all. So thank you so much. I'm gonna check whether we have questions in the chat. Again, if you would like to intervene by raising your hand, that's also fine. In the meanwhile, I have some questions for you if you want to reply. I mean, what do you think is the contribution of this rich body of literature to the existing debate on the violence and its aftermath in Peru? Is like, what do you think that a contribution can come? What can we learn about the war by reading these stories and these novels? Something that perhaps is absent from the official narrative or the narrative from all the groups that somehow participated in the violence. This is obviously a question that comes from someone who is not an expert in any way on this conflict. But if you had to like draw a conclusion and say, this is what you get by engaging with this fictional work, especially for researchers who perhaps are more used to work directly with the protagonists of violence and their direct testimony. And this perhaps applies especially to works that are not autobiographical, so like not written by people who have somehow been involved in the violence. And the second question is that have people who belong to the groups that participated in the violence, the military or the victims or the members of Sendero Luminoso, have they ever replied or spoken against the way in which they were portrayed in this or other stories? How did a dialogue ever emerge, between fictional characters and real characters? I mean, did something like that ever happen?
Yes. The first question, I think literature, fictional, is a free space to spoke about any subject. So after the report was published in 2003 of the Commission of Truth and Reconciliation, the tone is conciliatory. We have to forget and move on. But in literature, there was spaces are created to speak and to regret this posture of oblivion. So I think it's more. I think it's Victor Beach that said it. It's a place to mourn and to speak more with freedom and trying to see all the parts. Not to forget and move on. And it's the Peruvian literary field is very polarized. So the conflict polarized it even more. So yes, there is some actors are like doesn't agree with the representation with the fictional, even though it's fictional, with the fictional representation they have made. For example, the military. There is a former militaries. For example, I remember Samuel Cabero, that he was against the way the military were written in novels. That he wrote a novel himself. I think the novel is Caramelo Verde, green candy, and the tone is we were following orders, we are not so bad, and so yes, every actor tries to write about their experiences, and they are different and against each other.
That's fascinating. Thank you. I was wondering if anyone has other questions for Brenda. So it looks like almost that you're suggesting the idea that literature is not a continuation of the conflict, but still a kind of a minefield, no, for the dispute of meaning around the violence itself. Berenice, thank you.
Thank you very much for the brilliant presentation, Brenda. What about, have you done research on depictions of the conflict from abroad, from authors, foreign authors? So I know, you've described how there's a breach between the urban and cosmopolitan white Criollo authors and more like Andean authors, that matches the racial divide in Peru. But what about the depiction of the conflict through literature from abroad? For instance, there's a novel called The Dancer Upstairs, precisely written by a British novelist called Nicholas Shakespeare. And I found out about it because it was made into a film, which is not very good at all, called The Dancer Upstairs too, and it was directed by John Malkovich and starred Javier Bardem. I haven't read the novel, but I don't know if, I think you bring forward a very interesting debate about who claims the legitimacy to speak about the conflict. And I know that because I'm from the social sciences area and in memory studies, for instance, and in historical accounts and historical research, that's always a big debate, especially in contemporary history where many of the protagonists are still alive. There's always a debate with the historians that are younger and that didn't live the conflicts. And so the ones who live them say, who are you historians? Who are you academics to come and tell us that this is the way things happened? Well, we know how it happened because we lived it. So I know that that's an ongoing debate within historical and social sciences. So are you saying that the same thing happens in literature too? That perhaps authors from Peru would turn a blind eye and see depictions from foreign authors about the conflict in a negative point of view. So anyway, I just wanted to know if you've heard of that or what you would think about it. And also, I happen to know about another literary depiction of the conflict, but through comic. And this is by a Peruvian author called Jesus Cosillo. And graphically, through comics, the conflict is depicted in a very crude way. And so just engaging with what Eleonora was asking about and what you were saying, sometimes if you read the reports or you see the news or even if you see a documentary, the representation or the account of the conflict, sometimes it can only be told in an even cruder way through fiction. So when I was looking at this book with the comics and the comics were representing the violence in such a graphic way, obviously it's nothing compared to the way that it really happened, but still seeing it there in the comic, and it just adds a whole other dimension to help you understand the level of violence that the conflict entailed. So, thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Berenice. I agree with you. I think in literature, it's an ongoing debate. Who can write about the war? If only the author who lived during the war or in the conflict zone, or whoever wants to write fictionally, It's an ongoing debate. The Andino writers doesn't want the limeño criollos or pitucos, as they call the white or the authors who cosmopolite are the authors who are from Lima or even outside Lima, who lives, for example, Daniela Larcon, who lives in, I think he lives in New York. Claudia Salas Jimenez also lives, now she's in California. Santiago Roncagliolo, who is in Spain, and they, all of them publish in big publishing houses, no, Alfaguara, Anagram, and they have got prizes as well. But till now, it's a ongoing debate, and also in cinema. No, there are many adaptations of these works, as I say, Retablo, Double Hour, and other. I think it's The Passenger by Alonso Cueto that are adapted. I think The Passenger is a Mexican film, so they are. Some of these works are made for foreign public. And the impact in the arts, it's very interesting. It's a historical episode, very sensitive, so it's very violent when we read about it. And other art forms has been addressed it. So far, I think there are 2 graphic novels by illustrator Jesus Cosio, that is Rupey, Graphic Stories of the Violence in Peru, with text by Alfredo Villar and Luis Rosol, and other one is Brutality, Comics on Political Violence in Peru. In the visual arts realm, it's a major impact that means the altarpieces that are the most traditional and well-known folk art. The best examples are those of Edilberto Jimenez. And also there are interventions have been made, like Las Cantutas by Ricardo Vice, that you can find photographs. Vanished Glory, Gloria Evaporada by Eduardo Villanes, and La Bandera by Susana Torres Marquez, photographs by Gladys Alvarado. Another performance, I think, like Lava la Bandera or The Waves of Tingo. There are many different, Tránsito a la Memoria, La Chalina de la Esperanza, that is, it's made by a colectivo, no? A collective called Desvela. So there are many different ways to approach the conflict because it's very violent, and I think authors and artists in general have to experiment different ways to approach it, to know about all the, try to know all different parts of the people, mostly the victims that doesn't are nor senderistas, member of the Shining Path, or military. They were people who live in the area and were victims.
Thank you, Brenda. Any other questions? I'm just gonna check if there is anything that we can see. Alejandra?
Yes. Oh, hi. Thanks. First of all, I'm sorry, I can't turn off my camera. I can turn on my camera, sorry. But first of all, thank you to Professor Brenda, because everything was really interesting, and all her recommendations, I think they were really interesting to look up for. Well, I'm really I really like the part where she talked about Claudia Salazar, I think, because it's for me it's very interesting to see and to read novels, books literature written by women, because it's not very common to read something written by women, right? And I was actually interested about this because I'm like, my interest in every like field is about this, no? Like knowing to, like, yeah, knowing to the point of view of a woman, because it's more common to read books, novels, literature written by men. But it's very, very interesting. I think Brenda mentioned a book. It was La Sangre de la Aurora, I think. And I have written that book, and I have wrote. And it's really, really interesting. And I just wanted to thank you to include that book, that I really like that book, and that it's very important to start to read more of this kind of literature. Like every literature is important, but I think in the nowadays context, it's really important to know more about women novelists, and more if they are like, they write about history, about memory, about violence. And I don't know, I really like, and I can compare probably with another Latin American woman. She's Nona Fernandez. She's from Chile, and actually she's like my second favorite woman to read. So thank you, and thank you for all of your recommendation. I will look up for them.
Thank you, Alejandra. I concur with you. As I said before, for many years I have been studying Peruvian literature about the war, and I have only found 3 women who wrote. No, I think it's better to say who published works about this subject, that are Claudia Salazar Jiménez, Pilar Dugui, and Arely Araoz, and that's all. I think it's a problem that I am in Mexico and I can't find more. Probably there I think there have to be more that probably they were or are published in small publishing houses, and I can't find them. But it's I have shared with you all the works that I have found, and 3 only written by women. It's I think it's outstanding. There are many other works that are focused on the violence against women. I think sexually, and the rapes and all this stuff, but are written, and the narrators are also men. For example, Blue Hour by Alonso Cueto. One of the main part of the novel is the rape and the sexually abuse by the military to this woman, to this prisoner, but all the perspective is like to men. So one of my objectives are try to find more works that are written by women. In other countries, I think in Latin American countries that have also a near past with a conflict, like El Salvador or Colombia, and I don't know. For example, there are also literary works written by women who focuses on the war and the impact of the war in female bodies, I think, on female bodies and feminine characters. Like I was thinking about I forget, Claudia Hernández from El Salvador that has a novel Rosa Tumbaquema, or many works in Colombia. Lorena Salazar Mazo has a novel that is titled Esta herida llena de peces, that also talks about the war, the impact of the war in the community, in female communities and in female bodies.
Thank you, Brenda. Priscilla?
Thank you. First, I want to thank to the Professor Brenda Morales, because I think it's really important to speak out, and literature and music and all the 7 fine arts do work for that, to make the problems visible. I have 2 questions. Do you think authors become more vulnerable when they speak out, talking about violence? Like, they are more likely to be violented? And the second one is, have you heard about any music adaptations? Because I think through music, people can be more influenced. I've heard, for instance, about Chico Trujillo. They are a band from Chile, and they speak a lot about the inequality and all the problems of Chile. And I was wondering if you have heard about any music adaptation.
Thank you, Priscilla. I think authors are most vulnerable if they talk about the war. It depends on, I think, on its family experience and own experience. For example, I am thinking about Jose Carlos Agüero, that is an anthropologist and a historian, I don't know exactly, but he writes an essay that is called The Surrenders, and it's the story about his parents that were former members of the Shining Path. So it's a brilliant literary essay. It's translated, and but it's an essay. It's his personal history, his personal life. So I think it's an example of his case is more vulnerable, but other authors, like I have said, that wrote from the distance, temporary and space. I think it's not necessary that type of vulnerability. I think it's more I don't know how to say it in English. Tiene más oficio de escritura, y they can separate from the facts, no, the events. And in music, why no? I will write in the chat. Why no? Why no is the name of the indigenous music style that talks. I think it's like a sad music, and it's like chronicles made music, made music. These are like sad songs that talk about the war. You can look for it for them in, I think, in YouTube or platforms such as that, and you can hear from Huaynos about the war. And I have discovered another singer that her name is Renata. I can't Renata. I can't remember, but he sings in Quechua. He's very young. He sings in Quechua, rap and trap, and some of her songs are about the war.
Thank you, Brenda. We have a question in the chat from Dipti. They ask, do you think the literary depictions of different parties engaged in the conflict have contributed towards increasing or decreasing the hostilities, like by influencing mutual perceptions, for example?
I think they increased the conflict, I think, in 1980s, during the war. But now I think it's not the situation. I think, for example, in 2000, I think there was a congress in Madrid where authors from different origins, Peruvian authors, talk about the literary situation of Peru, and it was a battlefield. They fought very between them, but it was 2000, the year the conflict was finished, but there was any distance to reflect, so I think now there is not such a thing. I think it was 20 years ago. I can say that.
Thank you. Monica?
Hi, good morning. I am a student from the Latin American Studies College, and I don't speak English very well, but I'm trying my best to share my opinion. After reflection, I understand the importance and impact of the armed conflict in Peru and how this influenced the right narrative. In particular, the fact that most caught my attention was the Victor Beach. He says that the violence is never an alienated fact, and that is reflected in literature. But also the words can express the feelings from the people, and this has the power to bring the reader closer. And I think that it's really important for everyone. So I just want to say thank you for sharing this with us.
Thank you, Monica. I just understand you quite well. Victor Beach is a very interesting, he's a scholar in the Instituto de Estudios Peruanos, and he published a book called Poetics of Griefs, Poéticas del Duelo, where he studies I think the importance of the arts and literature in the mourning process in a country that where politics can't give the space to mourn and to do a proper process of grief. So it's very interesting, his work.
Thank you, Monica and Brenda. Do we have any other question? I think we still have some time if anyone has any final observation or question for Brenda. Okay. Maybe not. This was really interesting, Brenda. Thank you so much. I think I will have some more questions in the future, you know, when you actually have some time to digest all the information and reflect on colleagues' work. For now, I am really interested for my own research in understanding the military perspective on internal conflict in Latin America, and I've done some work on Argentina, which is a very different case, of course, but some things, you know, this this thing that you say about the polarization in the view of what the violence was and what it meant. It's definitely so alive and so difficult as long as the protagonists, of course, are still living and are still kind of coexisting as well. No, not just living, but also living together sometime, no? Crossing their paths. So I think studying this evolution through literature is a very interesting way of reflecting on these dynamics. So many, many thanks again for the work that you have done and for sharing it with us. And I just wanted to thank everyone again for being here. And I think this event is being recorded, so you will find it available on our channels. And I invite everyone to get in touch with Brenda if you have any further question or observation on her work. So many thanks again. And if no one has anything else to add, I think we can close this session and see you very soon in the next episode, which I hope will have the same great participation from everyone. Thank you so much, and take care, and see you soon.
Thank you.